Chat, oftentimes people ask me what the difference is between pro players and ranked players, right? What are pro players doing so differently that makes them a step above? Because when you look at players like Bolo, like Spoit, they're not just putting up ridiculous aim, okay? They're not just making crazy clips. They understand the game at a different level, and they almost play a different metagame than the players inside of rank. So today, I'm looking at the most recent Rainbow Six tournament, the Montreal Major, and we're breaking it down by the numbers. We're going over all the interesting facts and statistics that separate pro players from the ranked player base that we see inside of Rainbow Six Siege. As you know, the third term of the season has come and gone. W7M are major champions, and so looking ahead at SI, let's try to figure out where the meta is at, what operators are being played well. This is pre-patch, of course, so we don't have new Blackbeard in this patch. We don't have buffed Sens or buffed Thunderbird or any of the changes that came through in the most recent patch, but we do still have the old data to look back on and see kind of how things differed between this and ranked. So you may be familiar with these graphs. These are the graphs that Ubisoft put out detailing the operator presence versus win delta for every op in the game. And they do this twice or so a season, right after or right before every patch that comes out. And they kind of showcase, according to ranked players, which operators are being played a lot, which operators are being played a little, and if those operators are winning more or less than your average expected on each side. Now, I like these graphs a lot, but it doesn't really represent what's going on at the pro meta, so I made my own. Just like the Ubisoft graphs that they put out every single stage, I plotted win delta by presence rating. Now, I want to explain some things about this graph. I want to kind of break down what's going on these because there's a few things that I think aren't obvious at a first glance. First of all, notice that the win delta is much more spread out, right? We're ranging from like plus 25 to like minus 25. We go very high to very low, whereas in the Ubisoft, we're going like plus 5 to minus 5. That's a problem of sample size, okay? At the major, only a few hundred rounds, maybe 1,000 or so rounds are played, whereas in ranked, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of rounds are being played over the course of a tournament. So that's why you see a spread that's much wider for professional play than you do on the graph that sometimes Ubisoft puts out. You also have skews that go for defenders very heavily below and for attackers very heavily above. That's simply because that's how the average shines out for both sides. So at the major, defense averaged about a 55% win rate, meaning attack averaged about a 45% win rate. Because the average win rate for defenders is higher, the outliers are going to end up being lower on the extreme ends, right? Does that make sense? It's easier to be farther below 55 than it is to be above 55, and vice versa for the average of attackers being 45. It's easier to be higher than 45 than it is lower than 45, which is why our outliers skew so heavily in one direction or another. There's also some interesting operators on this graph, most notably Rook, who you may see all the way down here off the graph. Rook was played exactly one time at the major and he lost. So his win delta is technically negative 55% because 0% minus 55% of the average puts him all the way at the bottom. I wanted to still include him, so that's where he's at, but just know that he is all the way at the bottom for his sample size. Not a great operator. The other op that is misrepresented on this graph is Thunderbird. Thunderbird wasn't picked at all throughout the major, so her win delta is technically 0, but again, realistically, she's not a good operator. She kind of looks good based on this graph, but Thunderbird just really doesn't have any data to look at, so she's just at the 0-0 mark. Other than those two, there's a few operators that might be difficult to see right off the bat. You might see here, Maestro is just barely hidden behind Jaeger, very hard to see. The other operators that are hard to see are this little clump right here on defense. This is a clump of Tubarão, Fenrir, Smoke, and Castle, all of who are sitting at about a 35% presence and a slightly negative win delta. By chance, they happen to group up. Every other operator you should be able to see relatively well. Maverick and Nomad are kind of overlapped here, but I think that's pretty obvious. But there are two operators that are still missing. You can't see Azami and you can't see Monty, and that's because these images are cropped. When you look at the full graphs, it tells a very different story, where both Monty and Azami are islands away from every other data point. Over an 80% presence, nobody else comes anywhere near that. On attack, nobody's above a 50% presence, and on defense, there's a couple ops that are just above 50, but it's very, very close. Azami and Monty are far and away outliers in these graphs. And I think it's very obvious that in the eyes of professional players, these two operators are the most powerful ops on the attack and the defense. They are broken, at least from the former patch. Monty has obviously been nerfed since these games were played. They also both have positive win deltas, so Monty just slightly, but with an average, you expect it to kind of regress towards the mean, and you do see that much more for Monty than Azami. Both ops still winning more than they're losing. So let's take a deeper look at the attacker operators, and I think we can kind of make some categories based on the clumps that we see on this graph. First, you've got kind of the attacking mainstays. Other than Monty, you've got this little clump right here. That's based around like Dokkaebi, Grim, Ying, Ace, Deimos, and Blitz. These are really the mainstays of the meta at the last major. These are the operators that are often being banned out. They're easy ban contenders. They're operators that change the entire game based on their play. From Dokkaebi all the way to Monty, these are operators that fundamentally change the game around them based on the utility that they bring. So this is kind of the first group here of the meta mainstay operators. Following them up, you've got kind of the other meta ops. You can make kind of a loose category right here. These are all good operators as well. They're very good. They see lots of play, but they might not dominate the rounds as much as these operators over here. You're probably not banning these operators as much as you are the operators farther to the right, and they're not necessarily going to shift rounds entirely based on if they're being played or not. One thing you'll notice about these operators is that the more niche an operator is, the closer to the bottom it is when it comes to win delta. Did I say niche? Very generic operators are close to the bottom. So Buck, useful in a lot of situations. Thatcher, useful in a lot of situations. Striker, Ashe. These are all operators that are not very specific in their focus. They do a lot of things pretty well. They can be brought in almost any situation. Whereas the niche operators tend to grow to the top, right? Twitch, Capitao, Ram. These are operators that you're probably not bringing unless you have a specific problem that you know they're going to solve really well. And so it makes sense that their win delta is going to be a little bit higher than the more generic operators like Buck or Ashe. Beyond that, you've got kind of gimmick / pocket strat operators. I would consider that to be basically everybody else. The key thing with this category of operators is it's really not a category in its own, as more a sliding scale, right? Operators like Brava and operators like Zofia are really good operators that do find a place in the meta, but maybe their niche is just not quite as common as operators like Twitch or Capitao. Certainly, this kind of grouping of operators includes a lot of troll ops that don't get played. Blackbeard, Sens, Kali, Yana, Amaru. Operators that aren't so serious versus operators that maybe do have a place in the meta, but are just a little bit more niche. You could probably divide the group in half by drawing a line like right here, where operators to the left of this line are like kind of gimmicks, whereas the operators to the right are more just very niche, but it's a blurry line, of course, and that category really does overlap quite a bit with the meta ops themselves. On defense, you see a similar pattern, where you've got a real clump of operators that stick out pretty far away from the rest of the pack, who all have very average win deltas, but there seems to be a pretty decent gap between them and the rest of the ops that are all below average on the presence rating. And I think you can divide these meta operators into really three categories. You have the overpowered broken operator. That's Azami, of course, who we've talked about. Then you have kind of like the high meta operators. This includes Kaid, Nira, Mute, Legion, Valkyrie, Warden. These operators are all very generalist. You can bring these operators on almost every single site. They're very, very powerful. No matter what site you bring them on, they'll almost always get you good value. Then you get the medium meta operators. Again, this is a big clump that you can't really see that well, but it's Tuberau, Fenrir, Smoke, and Castle. Situational, for sure, but the situation that you need these operators for comes up quite frequently, and they all do their job pretty well. They're a little bit below the average win delta, but again, the average defender win rate is 55%. So a 50% win rate comes around right here, and all of them maintain over a 50% win rate. Then you've got the low meta operators. That's just Bandit and Goyo, operators that are extremely niche in a sense, but also extremely powerful. Bandit and Goyo can win rounds on their own. They're very, very good, but they need the right circumstance. You can't run them on every bomb site. There's a lot of sites in the game where they just don't make sense because of how their gadgets work. The rest of the operators here are a little bit different because there's a very wide spread in the win deltas, although all of them are relatively low on the pick rate. I feel like the operators up here in the top quadrant, including Alibi, Mozzie, Solus, Aruni, Pulse, Scopos, Sentry, Ella, Wamai, and Echo, are all good ops, but like very, very specific. Rarely are these operators required with their utility. Echo's a great example of an operator who provides a ton of value, but is only good on like a handful of sites. Some ops like Alibi might just be inflated because they have a very small pick rate. You know, any operator that's this close to the 0% presence rate is probably not data you can actually read into. I think Alibi was played 3 times and went 2-1. So hard to read into that too much, but in general, the top left of this graph does feel like the operators that are very strong, but very niche. And then in the bottom left, you get kind of the troll operators. You still have some decent ops here. You know, Melusi, Vigil, Clash. These are operators that certainly can be good. They certainly have their moments, but that moment seems to be more and more infrequent. I'm a little surprised to see Melusi this bad on the win delta. I'm not exactly sure why. She has an almost perfectly average pick rate, but maybe just too generic, right? Maybe the hyper-specific utility that these other operators bring in kind of the meta category is a little bit more powerful. So an interesting kind of thing, and then you've got a lot of ops that just bring 0 utility, right? Rook, no utility. Oryx, no utility. Doc, no utility. Cav, no utility. Thunderbird, no real utility. And then you've got ops like Tachanka, Thorn, really bad utility. Jaeger, I would put in that camp as well, just bad util. With the information now in our brains, I want to take a moment to kind of compare the ranked charts up against the professional charts. And one thing you'll notice right off the bat is that with the exception of a couple, right, like maybe Finka, all the operators that ranked players are using are also being played often by the pros. So if you take like this subset of operators from the ranked players, all of them are high on the list for pro players. Ashe is right here. Ace is right here. Buck is right here. They don't have the best win rates, but they're all being played above average when you look at their presence percentage. The inverse is not true. There are a couple of big operators that are being played a ton by pro players, are being valued very heavily, that ranked players just don't seem to give a shit about. Ying is a big one who's all the way up here for pro players, but just in this big clump somewhere for casual players. Another one is Grim, who very, very common, very good for pro players, but not as good for ranked. And then Deimos is the last obvious one. These aren't even edge cases. These are some of the best ops in the game at a pro level, but they just don't really stand out at all when you look at the data from casuals. They all have a below average win rate, and they all have a below average pick rate. This makes sense given the operators that they are, right? Ying, Deimos, and Grim are 3 operators that require a lot of coordination. Deimos has to give callouts to his teammates. Grim and Ying are execute operators that require everybody to be committed to the push all at the same time. It makes sense that they wouldn't be as common in ranked, where that coordination is a lot less popular. It doesn't happen as much, a lot less frequent. I do not know why ranked players are so obsessed with Jackal still. He is one of the most played operators outside of this big clump that seems to be the meta. He is almost dead last in terms of ranked players. I think that is just a byproduct of Deimos being so good. Deimos and Jackal do the same thing, more or less, but Deimos does it a lot better if you have that coordination. I think ranked players are also just kind of obsessed with Jackal bans because they have been since 2016. It's kind of interesting that Blackbeard is so high on the win delta for both. I wouldn't read into it too much. Their pick rates, their presence are both very low for competitive and for ranked, but still, I think it's kind of funny. We genuinely might see Blackbeard's win delta drop across both formats after his rework. I would expect that to be the case. We can look at the same chart for defense. The biggest discrepancy for defense is obviously Doc, leading the pack far and away for ranked players with almost a 50% presence, 45% presence rate for Doc. In pro players, that presence is below 5%, right? A massive drop-off between ranked and competitive. And when you look at the fact that Legion is also the second most popular defender in ranked, I think it really just comes down to the fact that ranked is in much more of a gunfight meta than professional Siege is. Pro Siege, certainly gunfights are important, but the utility is a much more important focus, whereas in ranked, the utility is not that impactful to more of the rounds. A couple other interesting factors that you see, a couple of other interesting differences. Vigil is very high in presence for ranked players compared to pro players. Vigil's presence was a lot higher for pro players if you go back like even 3 to 6 months, But I think the unreliability of the Boss G has really forced Vigil out of favor for a lot of professionals. I also think Mozzie getting a bit of a buff and really picking up on the pick rate somewhat hurt Vigil's popularity. And given that Vigil still has a negative overall win delta, it might be that Vigil is overvalued by ranked players as well because that Boss G is so annoying to play against. But in actuality, most people can't be consistent with that gun. It's just too awkward and difficult to use. It is kind of funny that Rook has one of the highest, the second highest win delta in ranked, but literally the lowest possible win delta in competitive. Again, I think that comes down to the gunfight meta and the extremely low sample size that Rook has in professional play. Another interesting trend you see between these two graphs is Warden and Wamai, both having a very low win delta in ranked compared to relatively high win deltas in competitive. Again, I think this comes down to the fact that you see so much less Ying. Remember, Ying is being played almost all the time in competitive, but basically never in ranked. So if Ying's not being as important, I think it makes a lot of sense that operators like Wamai and Warden are not seeing anywhere near as much play inside of ranked games as you're seeing from competitive. So I don't think the low pick rate of Wamai or Warden is actually a bad thing from ranked players. I think that's just them adapting to the attacker meta that's being put forth on the other side. The Boss G is better than Callie's 50 cal. Okay. Callie is here and here, I guess. We've looked at the professional data. We've compared them to the ranked data. The next thing I want to do is take a look at some of the updates. Because right before the major, Ubisoft went on a bit of a buffing spree. They gave a bunch of little buffs to a bunch of operators that really weren't being played very much at all. So I want to take a look at these operators and compare the operators that got buffed, their win rate at the major and their pick rate at the major, to how popular they were pre-major, and see if any of the buffs that Ubisoft put forward actually made a difference. We're going to start with Zofia. Zofia, before the update, was an operator that had breaching charges, and they simply switched out the breaching charges for hard breach charges. They said that this adjustment aims to enhance her versatility, enabling Zofia to handle both soft breach and hard breaching tasks by equipping her with breaching charges. They hope to provide more teams with greater flexibilities to strategies and operator selections, fostering more creative and diverse strategies similar to Capitao or Zero. Before the update, Zofia was picked about 11.5% of the time inside of Stage 2 regional leagues. At the major, after the buff, that fell all the way down to 9.96. This was the biggest drop-off of any operator's pick rate between the two patches. I think the reality is Zofia players don't want hard breach charges. Right? Zofia's role in the meta is an operator who does one thing very, very well. She counters bandit. She stops bandit tricking. She plays from below extremely well. She likes her soft breach. She's a great operator for soft breach. And if you need a lot of breach, plus you need to stop maybe a bandit or something, she's a good operator to pick. I didn't really see any pro teams bringing Zofia with can openers at the Montreal Major. I'm sure it happened here or there, but from my memory, I don't remember ever seeing a Zofia with can openers. So I don't think this change really did anything for Zofia, and in fact, it maybe even made her worse. The next buff was for Jackal. For Jackal, they removed the visor distortion when getting shot. Doing this allowed Jackal to use his Inox more effectively, making it easier to track enemies, even in high-pressure situations. This change allowed him to provide more consistent intel for his team, keeping the visor active for longer periods. They believe this doesn't serve as an effective counter, but rather just makes it less user-friendly. This is a very small change. Before the major, Jackal was picked about 3.5%. After the major, it fell to less than 2.5%. Obviously, this is not a nerf for Jackal. This is a pure buff. I think really what plays into Jackal's pick rate falling more than anything is just more pro teams getting comfortable with Deimos, getting better with Deimos. We saw a higher level of play at the major than we typically see in the regional play. And as Deimos pick rates goes up and up and up, Jackal's is going to go down. So I do think this was a good change from Ubisoft, but ultimately it really didn't matter. Next, we move to Kali. Kali had a couple of big changes. First of all, they added her smoke grenades. I don't think that's a bad change at all. It didn't take anything away. A pure buff to Kali's secondary utility. But then they also buffed her sniper rifle. In fact, the main thing they did with it was they reduced the bullet trail. They made it last 1 second instead of 2, and they reduced the size by 75%. Now, maybe this has a big effect in competitive. or sorry, maybe this has a big effect in ranked, but in competitive, we saw Collie's pick rate basically not change at all. Whether the bullet trail on that sniper rifle is 1 second or 2 seconds or large or small, you're not able to bring Collie on the vast majority of sites. Her pick rate basically didn't change. I do think smokes being added to her kit is nice, but ultimately, you're not using Collie for smoke plants. If you're going for a smoke plant with a sniper, you're going to have the Glaz instead. So it just doesn't really make sense on Callie's kit. It doesn't impact her that much. And again, we see another buff that ultimately resulted in a pick rate going down, but just slightly. The next operator that got buffed was Yana. Yana is an operator that, as you saw, had a very, very low presence rate. She had an 89% pick rate in the regional league. She was the least picked operator on attack other than Blackbeard before she got buffed. And for Yana, they decided that they were going to reduce the cooldown of her Gemini Replicator from 20 seconds instead of 30. They said the primary advantage of using the Gemini Replicator is that it doesn't result in a loss when destroyed. However, the 30-second cooldown feels restrictive. That means you only get to use it a few times per round, which doesn't feel impactful enough. To address this, we reduce the cooldown time when it is deployed. The problem is it's still not impactful. Yana's gadget is bad. It's always been bad. It will probably always be bad. Because information is a very low value resource for attackers, right? Every attacker spawns into the game with 2 drones. Yana getting more drones that don't do anything special and that are actually easier to destroy, easier to spot, and don't last long like drones can to set up flanks and stuff, makes them bad. Whether you get 1 or 2 more uses in a round doesn't really matter. Yana didn't change here at all. Unless Yana has a good gun, her gadget's so bad that I don't think she'll ever really be a mainstay in the meta. And Yana has like a decent gun right now, of course, but her secondary utility is really, really bad. And she pales in comparison to like Ashe and even Striker in a lot of situations, and IQ and Twitch. There's never really a reason to bring Yana. Now we're going to get into the operators that actually did see a bit of a change with their buffs. Zero was an operator who previously had 4 cameras. And we've talked a lot just about Yana of how cameras and information isn't very valuable on attackers. But they gave Zero 2 extra cams, so now he had 6 Argus cams instead of 4, and his pick rate went from 1.16 to 1.35, which is not that big of a change ultimately, but his win rate was very good. And so I do wonder if maybe this change made Zero more effective in the few sites where he is seen often. His most common map by far was Bank. Bank is like the home of Zero. Setting up cameras inside of lobby can be really hard to find, can provide a lot of good value. And we did see, I think, more of that at the Montreal Major than we saw previously in regional leagues. And when it got brought out, it had a very high win rate, 64%. Was this buff really that impactful? I'm not sure. I didn't necessarily see anybody using all 6 cams in a round or even 5 of them. But if it at least gave players a reason to bring this up more often, if it gave them more value in their minds to bring Zero more commonly and get more value out of them, then I think it did something there. Then you have Mozzie. And when I saw this, I thought this buff was like relatively small. Mozzie's maximum resources for his pests went from 3 to 4. That seems pretty small. Additionally, they did add impact grenades. But considering Mozzie has C4s, the best secondary gadget in the game, that shouldn't really be that big of a difference. But oh my fuck was it. Mozzie went from a 3.5% pick rate to almost a 12% pick rate, close to a 4x increase in how commonly we saw Mozzie, and his win rate was very good. 66% on a defender? That's out of this world. That's a very, very high win rate, alongside a huge upgrade in the pick rates. Now, I want to say, I don't think the impacts made any difference at all for this buff. I didn't see a single Mozzie running impacts, and I was looking out for it at the Major. Every single time I watched a Mozzie personally, he was playing Nitro Self. So I don't think that really mattered. And I don't know that the 4 pests even had that big of a difference, but I think it again gave players enough value in their minds to think, hey, I guess it's worth picking Mozzie. So I think ultimately it still did end up being an impactful buff. And far and away of all the buffs, this was the one that actually mattered and, in my opinion, actually made a difference on the meta that we saw at the Montreal Major. Just giving players the opportunity to pick this operator more, giving more value, stopping more drones from entering the building was enough to see his pick rate go up, and with excellent weaponry, his win rate went up as well. Thank you for watching and taking a look at the stats. That's all that I have for you when it comes down to the numbers of the Montreal Major. I do hope that you enjoyed, but I still appreciate you coming by. And for everybody else, thank you for checking out the stream.